Before we can do any reprojection or image-based modeling, we need to have an accurately calibrated camera. So these images here were shot on a smartphone, and I'm not really sure what the field of view is. I'm not really sure what the lens was or the size of the image plane. So rather than try to figure any of that out, there's enough parallax in this shot. I think we can probably use the CameraTracker to figure it out for us. So I'm just going to drop down a CameraTracker, and we'll use the CameraTracker to figure that out and calibrate the camera and also match move the shot. So let's walk through this a little bit while we're here. The CameraTracker can be used in a couple modes. Sequence mode, where you feed it movies like this, and stills mode, where it's a little bit more tolerant to bigger changes between images. We're going to use it in sequence mode. We want to track the entire range, and this camera is a free camera, which means that it's moving, translating through the scene, and also rotating. There's another couple of types of moving camera that are subsets of this under here: planar motion and linear motion. And you have to be a little bit more careful when you do these. Any of these other modes besides free camera, rotation, linear, and planar, you probably should have some lens information for these latter two. It will help a lot. Rotation only, if you do not have the lens and the image film back size for the camera, you will not get an accurate rotation only track. So free camera is one of the few cases where we can get away without populating any of these fields, and that's the case we have here, so we're just going to go with it. The focal length is unknown constant. I don't know if this has lens distortion, so we won't set anything up here. And then the film back size, let's go ahead and make this something smaller, like I'm going to make it the same size as Super 16, because that's about the smallest. See if Sony has something smaller, or video camera setting. It looks like pretty much all of these are, there you go, this is the same aspect ratio at least. So we'll use this XL1, and it's got a fairly small sensor, but I don't know how big the sensor size was on this. I only know that it's this aspect ratio, so we'll go with that. Unknown constant. And then the only other thing that I like to edit is under the settings before hitting the track button. I like to track more features just to get a little bit more paranoid, because my thought is more better, because especially on a fast moving shot, you don't know if features will be occluded, and being a little greedy. Detection threshold here, if you set this lower, it will detect fainter features. It seems to be detecting a pretty good mix of features here. Maybe I'll turn it down just a little bit. And feature separation will allow features to be closer together by turning this down a bit. The one I think that is kind of important that isn't turned on by default is to refine feature locations. And what this does is it causes these auto track points to try to find corners. It sort of snaps to corners. And then I like to turn up minimum length a little bit. This makes the criteria a little bit more strict for the length of a track, so it's going to have a 2D track that lasts for at least 5 frames. And then outside of that, I pretty much leave all the defaults alone. The defaults, actually, typically you can run this with just the defaults and get a pretty good result most of the time, just so that you know. And then the next step is to just hit track. That took about 3 minutes, and as you can see, Nuke tracked all the features that it could automatically identify for as long as it could. And now to create a 3D camera for this, you just click the Solve button, and Nuke will go through and analyze all of these 2D points that it has tracked and attempt to fit them into a 3D solve for the camera. So that looks like this is almost done, and it has done a solve, and then it's reporting the error, the cumulative error, or the average error for all of the frames, which is still a little bit high. I mean, really, if we get this down to about 1 or below 1, that's good. And since this is a little bit on the high side, let's try to touch this up a bit. So if we go to the Auto Tracks tab here, we can adjust max track error, and this will force Nuke, the solver, to disregard points below this threshold of quality in terms of the solve. So that might be a little bit aggressive there. Let's turn this one down to 6, and I'm going to delete the unsolved or the rejected tracks. So now Nuke no longer has those bad tracks as part of its solution, and as you can see, its error has gone down quite a bit. You could continue to keep nudging that down until you got a solve that was hopefully closer to 1 or below 1. But if you run out of auto tracks because none of them are high enough quality, then you really won't be able to solve it using auto tracks. You'd have to use user tracks that you would add in yourself and track and sort of coach through the whole scene yourself. And typically you need about 7 solid tracks at any given time to get a good 3D solve. So just keep that in mind. There's quite a few auto tracks here, so really there's a lot of room to continue to keep tweaking, but I'm gonna call this done for now. So that's the gist of using the CameraTracker. The next stage would be to create a camera, so let's do that here before we move on. I only really need a camera, but in this case I think I'm going to do Scene Plus, because this will create a point cloud and a bunch of additional stuff that will be useful for us in the next step. So Scene Plus, and I'll leave it linked to the CameraTracker. Hit create, and then Nuke has created a camera and a point cloud and a scanline render. So if we look at the scene node, we can see here's the point cloud that Nuke created, that CameraTracker created for us. And to me, it looks as if the world may not be oriented correctly. It looks like it might be a little, well, it looks like the camera's mostly level. Let's scrub through here. I think it might be mostly level. Might have chosen a pretty good ground plane for us. So this back wall is maybe not oriented perfectly along the, that would be the X. So if we wanted to make this a little bit more square so that everything was aligned a little bit more along the Cartesian coordinates, that will be useful in the next step. And we also want to make sure that the ground is actually aligned with what we want the ground plane to be. So I'm gonna do that here. I'm gonna basically go in and select what I want the ground plane to be. So all these points that are along the ground, I'm lassoing them. And then I'm going to tell Nuke to make this the ground plane. Now you got to have at least 3 points, because that's the minimum necessary to define a plane. So we'll just use these 3 points here. Right click, and then set the ground plane to set selected. And that should, we're going to jump back out into the 3D view. That should align that to become the ground. And it looks to me like those points have aligned to become the ground plane. But I still have the issue of the back wall not aligning along that axis that I want. So let's go back to the CameraTracker. And for the output tab here, I can start to, or scene tab here, I can spin the world around to orient it how I would like. So I'm going to now go back to the 3D view, and really my goal here is I want this back wall to line up with, I guess in this case it's closer to Z, so I want it to line up with the Z axis. Or actually, let's line up the Z axis to roughly the direction that the camera is moving forward here, and we'll make this back wall the Y or the X axis. So let's spin the whole world around until this back wall is lining up with the x-axis here. So I can use the rotate the world around the y here. And I'm using the mouse wheel to just spin the world around the y. And because I've already set the ground plane where I want it, it's rotating nice and flat. I don't have to worry about it getting cockeyed or diagonal or something like that because it's already, I've already identified the ground. So just using these point cloud points as a sort of point of reference, I'm aligning this. Just right now I'm just orbiting it to see if I've got it, if I've got it close. You could also just switch the 3D view to look down at it straight from the top or something like that. In this case, since we're trying to align it to be fairly well aligned with the Cartesian coordinates of the world. I think that's about as close as I'm going to be able to do using this technique. So there we go. So I've got my camera tracked. I've got my world fairly well aligned. And the next thing to do, if I had to set the scale of the world, I could adjust the scale using the uniform scale control of this. Or I could use scale constraints if I had some survey markers in the scene. Since I have no idea of the actual scene scale, I can't really use scale constraints to set anything. So I would have to maybe bring a piece of geometry in that was a piece of survey geometry that somebody else created, or just work at an arbitrary scale, which is what we're going to do moving forward.